July 1st, 2026. Iranian state television. Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament and Tehran's chief negotiator with the United States, looks into the camera and says something very specific. He says, reports of expanded nuclear inspection access are lies. His exact words, translated. Under this law, no access whatsoever will be granted to sites that have been bombed and damaged. He names exactly two facilities inspectors are allowed near: the Bushehr power plant and the Tehran research reactor. Everything else, Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan, the places where the actual enrichment happened, the places the United States and Israel spent 5 weeks bombing back in the spring, permanently closed. Not closed for now, not closed pending negotiations. Closed, in his words, under any circumstances. I want you to actually sit with the weight of that phrase for a second. Under any circumstances. That's not diplomatic hedging. That's not we'll revisit this once the ceasefire is secure. That's a parliament and a Supreme National Security Council writing permanence into law, in the middle of a war that technically hasn't been declared over. Okay, now here's the problem. 5 days before that broadcast, June 26th, in Japan, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, stood at a press conference at, of all places, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant and said the opposite. He said the Memorandum of Understanding signed by both the American and Iranian presidents states explicitly that nuclear activities at those material facilities will be supervised by the IAEA in all letters. His words. He told reporters, whether this happens the day after tomorrow or in 1 week or in 10 days, it's important but not essential. This is going to happen. So somebody is wrong. Either the memorandum both presidents signed guarantees inspector access to the bombed sites, or Iranian law permanently forbids it. These two things cannot both be true at the same time. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because almost every piece of coverage on this story is treating it like a scheduling dispute, like it's a question of when the inspectors get in, not whether. I don't think that's the real question at all. I think everyone's asking the wrong thing here. And by the end of this video, I want to show you why. And I want to show you what Iran actually gains from letting that contradiction sit there, unresolved, in public, for the whole world to argue about. Let's go. Here's what the headlines are asking. Will Iran eventually let the IAEA back into Fordow and Natanz? Will Trump apply enough pressure? Will the next round of Doha talks produce a breakthrough? That's the surface question, and it's not a bad question, it's just the wrong altitude. It's the question you ask if you assume both sides are working toward the same eventual outcome and just haggling over the calendar. But if you zoom out, the actual question is this. What does it mean, strategically, that nobody on earth, not the IAEA, not Israeli intelligence, not the CIA, not even, according to their own reporting, large parts of the Iranian government itself, currently knows for certain how much enriched uranium survived the American and Israeli bombing campaign, or where it physically is right now? And more importantly, why would Iran, given the choice, actually prefer that nobody finds out? Why would a state that insists, repeatedly, publicly, that its program is entirely peaceful, fight this hard to prevent the one process that would prove that claim? That's the real question, not when do inspectors get in. It's who benefits from the not knowing, and once you start asking it that way, the entire story rearranges itself. So let me give you the framework I'm going to use for the rest of this video, because I think it explains almost everything else that's happened in this conflict since February. And honestly, it explains a lot of Iranian nuclear strategy going back nearly 2 decades. I call it the Ambiguity Trap, but there's a more specific, more visual way to think about it, and it comes from physics, not political science. You've probably heard of Schrödinger's cat, the thought experiment where a cat sealed inside a box with a random trigger mechanism is, for as long as the box stays closed, neither definitively alive nor definitively dead. In the quantum framing, it exists in both states simultaneously, a superposition, right up until someone opens the box and looks. The measurement itself is what forces reality to collapse into one concrete outcome. Iran's nuclear stockpile, right now, today, is functioning exactly like that box. As long as the box, meaning the tunnel complexes at Isfahan, the buried enrichment holes at Fordow, the cascades at Natanz, stays sealed to inspectors, Iran's uranium simultaneously exists as several different things depending on who's asking. And Tehran gets to benefit from all of those interpretations at once. To the International Atomic Energy Agency, it's an unverified compliance gap, a paperwork problem, technically. To Israeli intelligence and to hawks inside the Trump administration, it's a live weapons threat that justifies continued military readiness, maybe further strikes. To the negotiating table in Doha, it's a bargaining chip worth billions of dollars in frozen assets and the promise of sanctions relief. Iran doesn't have to prove which one of those it actually is. It just has to keep the box closed and let each audience project its own fear or its own hope onto the sealed container. And the inspectors, Grossi, his technical teams, the entire verification apparatus built up over decades under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they are, quite literally, the observers whose entire professional function is to force the collapse, to make the ambiguity resolve into one single, measurable, documented fact. That's why access to those three sites specifically is arguably the single most consequential unresolved issue in this entire conflict, more consequential in the long run than the Hormuz tanker threats, more consequential than the day-to-day ceasefire violations. Because once inspectors physically walk in and take a certified inventory, the box opens. And once the box opens, Iran permanently loses the ability to be 3 or 4 different things to 3 or 4 different audiences at the exact same time. Does that make sense? Good. Let's build the case, piece by piece, because I don't want you to just take my word for the framework. I want you to see the actual evidence with real numbers so you can judge it yourself. Piece 1, the raw numbers, because this is where it gets genuinely alarming and most casual coverage skips right past this context. Before the February 2026 war started, the IAEA's own accounting, their own inspectors, their own instruments, before access was cut off, put Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity at 440.9 kilograms. Weapons grade is roughly 90%. 60% has essentially no civilian application whatsoever. None. Zero. There is no commercial power reactor on Earth that runs on 60% enriched uranium. Civilian reactor fuel typically sits under 5%. 60% exists for exactly one plausible reason. It represents most of the technical, industrial, and enrichment cascade work already completed on the road toward weapons-grade material. It's the expensive, time-consuming part of the process, already finished. And Grossi has been explicit about the math here, using the IAEA's own significant quantity yardstick, the measurement the agency uses globally to estimate how much fissile material is needed for a single device. That stockpile, if pushed the rest of the way to 90%, would be enough material for approximately 10 separate nuclear devices. 10. Not one theoretical bomb sitting in a warehouse somewhere. 10, according to the IAEA's own standard method of calculation. Now here's where it gets genuinely murky, and this is the part that should actually concern you more than the raw stockpile number. After the June 2025 strikes and the much larger February through April 2026 campaign, satellite imagery, this is from the Institute for Science and International Security, a well-regarded non-proliferation watchdog that's been tracking Iran's program for years, not some fringe outlet, showed vehicular activity at the entrance to the Isfahan tunnel complex in the days before the strikes hit, including what appeared to be trucks moving blue overpack containers, the specific kind of container used to transport enriched uranium safely into those tunnels. Grossi himself has said publicly that he believes most, but he's been careful, precise even, to say less than 70% of the total stockpile is inside that Isfahan complex specifically, which means the remainder, potentially over 30% of a stockpile large enough for 10 weapons if fully enriched, is currently unaccounted for by anyone outside Iran. Could be at Fordow, buried under a mountain. Could be in a lesser-known tunnel complex built at Natanz back in 2007 that most casual viewers have genuinely never heard of. Could be at a newer facility analysts have nicknamed Pickaxe Mountain, precisely because almost nothing public is known about it. Nobody outside Tehran knows for certain. And I want to be precise here because this channel doesn't do fear-mongering with numbers just to juice a thumbnail. The IAEA's own June 2026 Safeguards report explicitly, formally states that it does not currently have enough information to say where that material sits. That's not me speculating from a podium. That's the IAEA's own written institutional conclusion in an official report to its own Board of Governors. Piece 2 of the evidence. And this is the part where Iran's public position starts to look less like blanket paranoia and more like a calculated, adjustable strategy. In September of 2025, after the first, shorter 12-day war, Iran actually did let inspectors partially back in. Grossi and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi personally signed an agreement in Cairo. This is documented on video. It's in the UN's own media archive, on what were called practical modalities for resuming inspections. Grossi called it, in his own words, an important step in the right direction, and said it was encouraging that Iran had declared its willingness to stay inside the non-proliferation regime rather than withdraw entirely. Inspectors did return to some sites under that Cairo framework. Bushehr resumed routine monitoring. The research reactor stayed open. Facilities that weren't bombed kept functioning more or less normally under IAEA oversight. But the moment the bigger war restarted in February 2026 and the bombing got significantly worse, this time targeting leadership, not just infrastructure, killing Iran's supreme leader in the opening strikes, that entire Cairo framework collapsed almost immediately, and Iran's parliament passed the new law Kalibaf was citing on July 1st. And notice the precision of that law. It's not a blanket suspension of all cooperation with the IAEA. Iran didn't walk away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty entirely, the way North Korea eventually did. It's a law with one very specific, very deliberate carve-out. Damaged sites stay permanently sealed. Undamaged sites stay open. This isn't Iran refusing all international scrutiny out of general defiance. This is Iran calibrating, almost surgically, exactly which doors stay open for the world to see and which doors stay welded shut. And the doors that stay shut are, not coincidentally, exactly the ones that would answer the one question the entire international community actually needs answered. And it's worth noting how quickly the earlier, more cooperative posture evaporated. The Cairo Agreement was signed in September 2025. The new, far more restrictive law passed sometime after the February 2026 strikes resumed, meaning the entire window of expanded cooperation lasted only a few months before the next round of bombing gave hardliners in Tehran's parliament exactly the pretext they needed to reverse it. That's important because it tells you the earlier openness wasn't a change of heart about transparency and principle. It was a conditional concession, offered while the immediate threat of renewed strikes felt lower, and withdrawn the moment that threat became concrete again. Cooperation, in other words, has tracked the war, not the underlying safeguards obligations Iran signed up to decades ago under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Piece 3, and I think this is the piece that reveals the actual motive more clearly than anything else in this story. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and for anyone unfamiliar, this is one of the most respected non-proliferation analysis organizations that exists anywhere in the world. They're the people behind the doomsday clock you've probably seen referenced in headlines every January, has characterized Iran's overall nuclear posture not as an active weapons program racing toward a bomb, and not as a purely peaceful civilian energy initiative either. They call it nuclear hedging. And the definition matters here. Hedging means a state builds and maintains the full technical infrastructure required to assemble a weapon on relatively short notice, while deliberately stopping short of actually crossing that final threshold. Their assessment, specifically, is that Iran is using the enrichment program and its accumulated stockpile as leverage inside ongoing negotiations, that Tehran has repeatedly signaled a willingness to dilute or physically export the higher enriched material in exchange for two things: meaningful sanctions relief and some kind of credible guarantee against future attack. Read that combination again. slowly, because it's the whole thesis of this video in one sentence. The uranium isn't primarily a weapon sitting there waiting to be used. It's a hostage sitting there waiting to be ransomed. And hostages, this is just true. Whether we're talking about geopolitics or a kidnapping negotiation, hostages only retain leverage value while their fate remains uncertain to the party paying the ransom. The instant IAEA inspectors physically walk into Fordow with radiation detectors and a certified accounting process and produce a formal, internationally recognized inventory, the hostages' negotiating value collapses to something close to zero, because now everyone, the E3 in Europe, Washington, Tel Aviv, the UN Security Council, knows exactly what's there, and, just as importantly, exactly what isn't there. Ambiguity is the entire asset being protected here. Certainty destroys it completely, permanently, in a single afternoon of inspection work. Piece 4, and this one is more about the audience inside Iran than the audience outside it, because I don't think you can fully explain a law this rigid without looking at what's happening domestically. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the opening strikes of the February 2026 war. His funeral processions and lying-in-state ceremonies were still being held across multiple Iranian cities in the first week of July, meaning this entire inspection standoff is unfolding in the middle of an active succession crisis for the regime's highest office. At the same time, a government-conducted poll circulating in June found that nearly 60% of Iranians reported they were unable to continue their lives financially, and roughly 70% of the population said they wanted fundamental government change. That is not a stable backdrop for any government, let alone one mid-transition. And it's not just economic frustration sitting quietly in the background. Armed clashes broke out in early July between Kurdish opposition groups and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in the northwestern cities of Sardasht and Piranshar, with human rights monitors reporting several people killed in fighting that involved heavy weaponry near residential areas. Put yourself in Kalibaf's position for a second. You are the public face of nuclear negotiations, in a country that just lost its supreme leader to a foreign strike, facing internal armed unrest, and a population that is, by its own government's polling, overwhelmingly frustrated and financially desperate. Standing on state television and declaring that you will never let foreign inspectors walk through the wreckage of your bombed nuclear sites isn't just a negotiating position aimed at Washington. It's a domestic performance aimed at Tehran, at the IRGC, at the hardliners who need to see strength projected outward at the exact moment the regime looks weakest at home. Sovereignty, in this specific moment, is being marketed as dignity. And that's a real additional layer of motive sitting underneath the pure negotiating leverage explanation. This isn't only about what Iran gains at the table in Doha, it's also about what the government needs to be seen doing for an audience that has absolutely nothing to do with uranium enrichment levels at all. Okay, now let's pivot, because there's a piece almost nobody in the mainstream coverage is connecting to this story. And it happened in the exact same 48-hour window as Kalibaf's statement, which I don't think is a coincidence. On July 2nd, the day after Kalibaf's broadcast, Iran issued a separate warning to commercial oil tankers, telling them to strictly adhere to designated shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, or face what Iranian officials explicitly called a forceful response. This follows actual attacks on vessels in the strait just days earlier, on June 27th, attacks which triggered US strikes on Iranian coastal radar and military sites in what the Pentagon described as an effort to protect commercial shipping. Across this conflict, at least 14 seafarers have been killed and more than 40 vessels attacked. Brent crude has been holding stubbornly near $73 a barrel, and traffic through Hormuz, one of the most economically important choke points on the entire planet, the route for a massive share of the world's seaborne oil, is still being funneled through just 2 temporary corridors, because the central shipping lanes remain mined and effectively unusable. There's a regional dimension layered underneath this too, and it's worth naming because it shapes how much room Iran actually has to keep running this play. When Iran retaliated against the February strikes, it didn't just target Israel and American bases. It fired on Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, several of which had spent years quietly deepening ties with Tehran. That broad retaliation cost Iran real diplomatic capital across the Gulf, at exactly the moment it needs Gulf states like Qatar and Oman functioning as trusted mediators in Doha. So the ambiguity strategy isn't cost-free. Every week the box stays shut is also a week Iran is asking recently attacked neighbors to keep vouching for it at the table. A genuinely fragile position to negotiate from, and one more reason this standoff can't drift forever without consequence. Why does this matter for our nuclear story specifically? Because it's the same actor running the same fundamental play across two completely separate boards simultaneously. On the nuclear board, Iran is withholding information, keeping the box closed, preserving ambiguity about the stockpile. On the Hormuz board, Iran is threatening to withhold something the entire global economy directly depends on: safe, predictable oil transit through a choke point with no easy substitute. Neither move is a full return to open war. Neither one burns the entire relationship down. Both are forms of controlled, reversible, carefully calibrated pressure. Both are designed to remind Washington, in extremely concrete dollar and cents terms, exactly what no deal costs everyone else who isn't Iran. This is coercive diplomacy running on two parallel tracks at once, using two completely different kinds of leverage, one informational, one economic. And the timing here matters enormously. Both moves surfaced in the same 48-hour window, right as the Doha technical talks wrapped up without a breakthrough on June 30th and July 1st. That's not chaos. That's coordinated pressure applied deliberately right before the next scheduled round of negotiations, designed to strengthen Iran's hand at exactly the moment the two sides sit back down. Now let's zoom out further, because there's a historical pattern here that I think is genuinely instructive, and it's one a lot of people watching probably lived through the headlines of without ever fully connecting the dots. December 2002. North Korea, under mounting international pressure over a suspected secret uranium enrichment program, one separate from its declared plutonium track, expels IAEA inspectors from the Yongbyon nuclear facility. 1 month later, in January of 2003, Pyongyang formally withdraws from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entirely, becoming the only state in history to do so after previously joining. For the following several years, the world operates almost entirely on speculation and worst-case intelligence estimates about how far North Korea's program has actually advanced. Different agencies in different countries produce wildly different assessments. Diplomats argue past each other in six-party talks that go essentially nowhere, and sanctions get imposed and readjusted based largely on guesswork rather than verified fact, because there's no one left on the ground to verify anything. Then, October 2006, North Korea detonates its first nuclear device underground, and years of diplomatic ambiguity end in about the worst possible way it could have ended, with a confirmed, undeniable nuclear test, not a negotiated resolution. I am not telling you Iran is North Korea, and I'm genuinely not telling you a test is imminent. The regimes are different. The regional alliance structures are different. Iran remains, at least for now, formally inside the Non-Proliferation Treaty in a way North Korea chose to abandon. But the strategic logic running underneath both situations is identical, and it's worth naming precisely. The withdrawal of inspectors doesn't just hide information from outsiders, it fundamentally changes the entire negotiating dynamic because it forces every outside power, the United States, Israel, the E3, the IAEA itself, to negotiate against their own worst-case assumptions instead of against verified, agreed-upon facts. And that uncertainty isn't some unfortunate side effect that a hedging state has to tolerate. It is, quite literally, the product being sold at the negotiating table. Confusion, in this specific strategic context, is not a bug. It's the entire business model. There's a second historical echo worth mentioning here too, and it cuts in a genuinely different direction, which is important for intellectual honesty. Iraq, 1998. Saddam Hussein's government finally ejects UNSCOM weapons inspectors after years of restricted access, obstruction, and cat-and-mouse maneuvering around specific presidential sites. What followed those years of ambiguity wasn't clarity, and it wasn't a confirmed weapons test either. It was roughly 5 years of intelligence agencies across multiple countries producing increasingly confident-sounding public assessments about weapons programs that, we would later learn definitively after the 2003 invasion, largely did not exist in the form that had been claimed. That case cuts the other way, and I think it's genuinely important to keep in your back pocket while you watch this Iran story unfold, because it's a warning in the opposite direction. Sometimes the ambiguity a regime creates through obstruction doesn't just get exploited by that regime for negotiating leverage, it also gets exploited by outside powers who use the fog of not knowing to build a public case for military action that the actual underlying facts, once finally uncovered, would never have supported in the first place. Ambiguity is a weapon that can be picked up and used by more than one side of the table. Now let me steelman the position I've spent a good chunk of this video arguing against, because the strongest countercase here is genuinely strong, and I don't want to pretend otherwise just to make my own thesis look cleaner. Here's the best, most charitable version of Iran's stated position. These are active, recently bombed nuclear facilities, hit with American bunker-buster munitions specifically engineered to penetrate hardened underground structures. These sites may well be structurally unstable, contaminated with residual radioactive material in unpredictable ways, or physically dangerous to enter without extensive remediation first. Iran can reasonably argue, and some genuinely neutral voices, including Oman's foreign minister, who mediated the earlier round of talks and has been openly critical of the initial strikes, have made variations of this exact point, that allowing foreign inspection teams into a site that remains, functionally, part of an active or recently active war zone, under a memorandum signed while missiles were still occasionally flying between the two countries, creates a genuinely real security risk, both to the inspectors themselves and to Iran's basic ability to control who has physical access to sensitive infrastructure during an unresolved conflict. There's an even sharper, more compelling version of this argument, and it's the one I personally find most persuasive out of all of Iran's stated justifications. Inspection visits generate exact GPS coordinates, detailed structural assessments, and extensive photographic documentation of exactly what remains standing after a strike and what doesn't. In a war where the United States and Israel have already struck these precise facilities once, and where limited strikes on Iranian coastal and military assets continued as recently as late June 2026, Iran has a genuinely legitimate argument that opening these specific sites to outside inspection teams is functionally equivalent to handing target refinement intelligence directly to the same two countries that already bombed them. That's not paranoia dressed up as policy. That's a rational actor in an active and formally unresolved conflict, declining to voluntarily improve its adversary's targeting picture for a possible second round. So what does that strong argument actually fail to account for? I think two things, and both of them matter. First, timing, plain and simple. If this were purely a safety and security concern tied to active hostilities, you'd reasonably expect Iran's position to gradually soften as the ceasefire held and stabilized over subsequent weeks, the way a temporary wartime restriction normally would. Instead, the position has calcified into permanent parliamentary law with an explicit "under any circumstances" clause and zero built-in sunset provision. A genuine safety concern is, by its very nature, temporary. It fades as conditions on the ground improve. A permanent legal bar, formally codified by both Parliament and the Supreme National Security Council, functions as a fixed policy, not a rolling, situation-dependent precaution. Second, and I think this is the bigger tell, the thing that really gives the game away, Iran has continued allowing inspections at Bushehr and the Tehran research reactor throughout this entire period. Sites that are, geographically and legally, just as embedded in an active conflict zone as the bombed facilities are. If the underlying concern were genuinely purely about physical safety during ongoing wartime conditions, that safety concern wouldn't apply so precisely and so exclusively to the exact locations where the missing enriched uranium is believed to be stored. The selectivity itself is the evidence. You don't get to claim a blanket, principled safety objection while simultaneously permitting unrestricted access to the two sites that pose zero threat to your negotiating leverage, and blocking only, exclusively, the sites that do. There's also a crucial piece of institutional context that further undercuts the simplest "we need this as leverage against future sanctions" reading, and it's important to get this exactly right. The old snapback sanctions mechanism, the one built directly into the original 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was already triggered by Britain, France, and Germany, the so-called E3, back on August 28th of 2025. Iran did not meet the E3's conditions within the required window, and the full slate of UN sanctions was formally reimposed by September 27th, 2025, with the European Union following 2 days later. That threat isn't hanging over Iran anymore as some future possibility to be avoided. It already happened, months before any of this July 2026 inspector standoff. Which means the inspection standoff we're watching unfold right now isn't primarily about avoiding a sanctions trigger that's already been pulled and already gone into effect. It's about controlling the terms of an entirely new, still being negotiated, final settlement with Washington, the one the current Memorandum of Understanding is meant to eventually produce. The stakes have quietly shifted from, will sanctions snap back? That question is already answered. They did. To, what does Iran get to permanently keep, and what does the world get to permanently verify inside whatever final deal comes next? That's a fundamentally higher stakes, more permanent negotiation than a 30-day sanctions countdown ever was. And it is exactly the kind of negotiation where controlled, deliberate ambiguity is worth substantially more to Tehran than a clean, fully verified bill of health from Grossi's inspection teams. So let's pull all of this together into one coherent picture, because we've covered a lot of ground. What you're actually watching, underneath the daily headlines about scheduling and access dates, is not a bureaucratic dispute over when inspectors get a visa stamped. It is a deliberate, carefully calibrated strategy by Tehran to preserve maximum ambiguity around its single most valuable remaining strategic asset, a uranium stockpile potentially large enough, if fully enriched, for approximately 10 separate weapons, whose exact current location and physical condition nobody outside Iran's own government can currently verify with confidence. That ambiguity is being deliberately run on parallel tracks at the same time. Nuclear opacity centered on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, and coercive economic signaling centered on the Strait of Hormuz, with both tracks surfacing publicly in the exact same week, both timed unmistakably around the ongoing Doha negotiations. And underneath both of those external-facing tracks sits a third, quieter one, aimed inward rather than outward, a leadership navigating a succession crisis, an economy in visible distress by its own government's numbers, and armed unrest on its own territory, all of which makes a public posture of unbending nuclear defiance politically useful at home in a way that has nothing to do with Washington, Vienna, or Doha at all. 3 audiences, 3 separate reasons to keep the box shut, one single law accomplishing all 3 at once. The historical parallel to North Korea's 2002 inspector expulsion shows us just how dangerous unresolved nuclear ambiguity can become if it's allowed to fester for years rather than months, ending eventually in a confirmed test rather than a negotiated settlement. But the counter-argument that Iran has genuine, legitimate wartime security concerns about opening recently bombed, potentially unstable sites to foreign inspection teams is real and substantial, and it only loses its persuasive force once you notice the selective, permanent, and precisely targeted way Iran has actually structured this particular ban. This is, in the end, a rational state actor extracting maximum strategic value from the simple fact of not being measured. And every single day that box stays sealed shut is another day that value quietly, steadily compounds. All right, Three specific things to actually watch over the next 48 to 72 hours, and I want these to be concrete and falsifiable enough that you can go check them yourself afterward and judge whether this analysis actually held up. Number one, watch whether the IAEA Board of Governors issues a new formal statement or resolution in the coming days, specifically addressing Kalibaf's July 1st comments. Grossi has previously warned, in careful diplomatic language, that this standoff cannot last forever, and he has floated, cautiously, without fully committing to it yet, the possibility of eventually declaring Iran formally in non-compliance with its non-proliferation treaty obligations. If the board moves toward that kind of formal declaration in the coming days, rather than continuing the current pattern of quiet, behind-the-scenes diplomacy, that represents a significant escalation in the paper war surrounding this conflict, even without a single additional missile being fired by anyone. Number two, watch whether the dedicated nuclear working group specifically, not the broader Doha talks track covering asset transfers and communications mechanisms, but the narrower committee focused specifically on accounting for the enriched uranium stockpile, actually reconvenes with a concrete, dated inspection schedule attached to it, as opposed to more vague statements about positive progress with no actual dates. Vice President Vance has already said publicly that overall talks are going well, but has separately acknowledged that the nuclear issue specifically hasn't really been substantively engaged yet. Watch closely for the gap between talks are going well as a general diplomatic statement and an actual signed, dated inspection schedule as a concrete document, because that specific gap is exactly where the ambiguity strategy I've described in this video continues to live and breathe. Number three, watch the Strait of Hormuz transit numbers directly. Specifically, watch whether daily transit through those two temporary shipping corridors climbs meaningfully toward the assessed maximum capacity of around 80 vessels a day, or whether it stalls out or drops instead. A rising number would signal genuine, functional de-escalation and real confidence building between the parties. A stall, or worse, a new tanker incident, especially if it happens anywhere close in time to a nuclear-related diplomatic setback, would strongly support the coordinated, dual-track pressure reading I've laid out across this entire video, rather than these being two unrelated stories that just happen to be sharing a news cycle by coincidence. And one bonus indicator, because it's easy to check and it tells you a lot. Watch whether Iran and Qatar or Iran and Oman make any new public statement reaffirming the mediator relationship. Given how much diplomatic capital Iran burned by striking Gulf states directly during the retaliation phase of this war, a visible cooling in that mediator relationship would suggest the ambiguity strategy is starting to cost Tehran more than it's earning, and that's usually the moment these standoffs finally break, one way or the other. For your homework this week, I want you to go read the source I pulled the hardest, most load-bearing numbers from for this video. Search for the Institute for Science and International Security's report titled Analysis of IAEA Iran Verification and Monitoring and NPT Safeguards Reports, specifically their June 2026 edition. It's fully public, it's genuinely detailed, and it will show you, in the agency's own careful language, exactly how much the IAEA itself openly admits it doesn't currently know, which candidate storage sites remain completely unaccounted for, what the satellite imagery does and does not actually confirm, and where the analysts themselves flag genuine uncertainty rather than papering over it with false confidence. Reading the primary document yourself, instead of relying entirely on a summarized headline or frankly on a video essay like this one, is the single best habit you can build as a serious consumer of this kind of news. And this is a genuinely good, accessible place to start practicing that habit. So here's the question I want to leave you with. And I don't think there's a clean, comfortable answer to it, no matter how long you sit with it. If a stockpile of enriched uranium sits inside a sealed, unverifiable box for long enough, surrounded by permanent legal barriers, competing satellite guesswork, and diplomatic language that never quite manages to close the actual gap between supervised in all letters and no access whatsoever, at what point does the difference between an ambiguous, hedged nuclear capability and an actual functioning nuclear weapon stop being a meaningful technical distinction at all and start being nothing more than a matter of which side of the argument you happen to be standing on at the exact moment somebody, someday, finally forces that box open?